Let me ask the same question. Why is it that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, there's a couple of things that we can determine from the text. First, and I think obviously, and something that Dr. Hart does point out and I concur with, Sodom and Gomorrah were judged because of grave sin. The sin was so bad in these two cities that there were not even 10 righteous people to be found. And Lot had his wife, his daughters, his son-in-laws. I mean, he probably had 6 or 7 different people as part of his family. That means if you accept them and just give the benefit of the doubt that these were relatively righteous people in the city, there were not even 3 or 4 outside of their family that God can term righteous enough to spare the city from complete destruction. In other words, the people in this city were completely and totally depraved. They were irredeemable. And whatever positive influence Lot might have had on the city through his involvement was for nil, because nothing influenced these people for good. That's why the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah was great and their sin exceedingly grave, according to chapter 18, verse 20. There was also a purpose to this judgment. And the purpose we read in chapter 18, verse 17 through 19. The judgment was to be a lesson to Abraham to encourage him to do righteousness and justice. God was forming this fledgling nation Israel. He was building them to be priests to the nations, and he must set up a method and a system and a culture that would protect these people so that they could do this job. And that was much of the law, was to establish a very precise type of people, culturally, religiously, that they might walk in this and be distinctive from the others. And God did many things early on that were very dramatic to demonstrate his seriousness about the moral purity of this new country that was emerging from Abraham's loins. One of the things that he wanted to do was show them how strongly he felt about unrighteousness and injustice. Both of those things were in view here. Therefore, he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah in the sight of Abraham, that he might understand. We actually learn a lot of other details about Sodom and Gomorrah from other locations in the Bible, and it's good for us to go there, because if we are thinking about what is going on here, we must look at all of the text that gives us any information that can help us to answer this question. Sodom and Gomorrah is also mentioned specifically and with some detail in 2 Peter chapter 2 and in Jude verse 7. Jude is only one chapter, so we just cite the verses. 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter says this. He says that Lot was oppressed by the, listen to the words here that Peter uses, by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, who by what he saw and heard, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day with their lawless deeds. That's verse 8. It says in verse 6 that God condemned and destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, quote, as an example to those who would live ungodly thereafter, close quote. These people were those, quote, who indulged the flesh in its corrupt desires and who despised authority. That's verse 10. We learn those things from 2 Peter. Now, what I'm attempting to do here is to go to these other verses and to assemble some facts, to make a list of the circumstance of Sodom and Gomorrah so that we might look at these facts as they're revealed, look at the circumstance, and ask ourselves, what of these possible interpretations do these other detailed facts speak to? Do these facts seem to be representing one interpretation or another? This is how we solve the problem about what God is talking about there in the book of Genesis. Are you with me on this method? Very, very important to me that you follow the method, because the method is the important technique that we use to unlock the truth, and I want you to understand it so that you can see this is not an ad hoc hypothesis. It's not something that's just coming off the top of my head because I'm with tradition and I think this way and I don't like homosexuals anyway and blah, 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 which isn't the case, by the way, but some people think that, and that's why I'm saying this, they suggest. No, I'm trying to find out what the Bible teaches about this, and so we're listing the things that the Bible teaches and trying to draw some conclusions. And we don't go just the book of Genesis because these issues are dealt with specifically in other places, and the historical circumstance there in Genesis is explained in different places, and that's why we go to 2 Peter and also why we go to Jude 7. Here's what Jude says. Jude describes the actions here as gross immorality and going after strange flesh. What does that mean? Well, let's look at the verse itself. Quote, just as, this is verse 7, Jude. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example, there we go, the teaching again, the purpose of this, in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. The question is, what was their sin? What was this strange flesh that they were going after, and some have suggested, well, you're misunderstanding the notion of strange flesh, because Jude has just been speaking about angels that leave their proper abode. And some think, from other things in the book of Genesis, that this proper abode was angels having sex with men to produce giants. Since Jude is referring to that, then when they talk about the men of Sodom as going after strange flesh, they were doing the same thing. They were going after angelic flesh to have sex with them, and it wasn't their homosexuality, it was going after angels that is spoken of here in Jude, verse 7. I don't think that's a reasonable interpretation. It is a possible one, because certainly that text is before it. It would lead one to believe that this was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. If in fact, when it says angels left their proper abode, it means that they tried to have sex with human beings. That's an interpretive thing. The text doesn't say what that means. It just means that they went out of their natural kind of abode to do something unnatural. What that is, it's not clear. The problem with this interpretation is that there doesn't seem to be any reference in the text or any indication that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah knew that these two visitors were angels. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even seem clear that Lot understood that. They both called them men. They assumed they were men, and therefore going after them as men is a significant factor in understanding this text. No, they weren't going after them as angels, therefore they weren't leaving their proper abode, in that they were lusting after a different type of being. They didn't know they were a different type of being. What way were they leaving their natural mode? Because they were lusting after the same sex. So strange flesh in this passage seems to me probably refers to homosexual flesh and not to angelic flesh. I could be wrong, but I think the arguments are good in favor of that interpretation. Not only those two passages, but there are 27 other references outside of Genesis where Sodom is mentioned. It is emblematic of gross immorality, deepest depravity, and ultimate judgment. In fact, the judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah is so severe that through the entire biblical record, we never see a judgment as bad as that until the book of Revelation. This judgment is without analog. This is unique. These people were so bad. What conclusions can we draw about what was going on? Let's look at those other verses kind of in summary. And here I am drawing from these details from the verses that I've just quoted to come to a conclusion about what was going on there. The sin, therefore, was some kind of activity. These are words from the texts, 2 Peter, Jude, etc. A grave, ongoing, lawless, sensuous activity. Sensuous activity. That Lot saw and heard, that tormented him as he witnessed it day after day, in which the inhabitants indulged the flesh in corrupt desires by going after strange flesh, ultimately bringing this devastating judgment upon them. Now I just have to ask a simple question. If this is a fair summary of the way the biblical writers describe what happens in the book of Genesis there in Sodom and Gomorrah, the question is, what activity fills that description? We only have a couple possibilities. We know two specific things about the conduct, the activity of the people who lived in that city. First of all, they attempted to rape Lot's visitors and therefore violated the high code of hospitality to Lot's guests. And I don't want to soft sell this in one sense, because the code of hospitality in those cultures were much more severe than in ours. It was a much bigger thing then for a guest to be violated, so much so that Lot would do with this seemingly ridiculous and immoral action of offering his daughters. He would rather see his daughters violated than his guests violated. That may tell us a little bit about Lot's character, but it also tells us about the way people viewed the inhospitality. So in all fairness, I must say that the issue of inhospitality was a big issue. But how big was it? Was it this big that God would destroy the whole city? That was the one thing we know about them. By the way, the inhospitality is not a specific point that's made in the text. It is an inference. The second thing we know is that they were homosexual. The text says they were homosexual, both young and old, all people from every quarter. They were so given to this that they would even ignore the available women that were being offered to them, Lot's daughters in this case. And even after they were blinded, they still persisted in their homosexual assault. Can you imagine guys going after, pursuing a woman, hey, I want to get her number, and then all of a sudden you're struck blind? Do you still think you'd try to find her? I think I'd be a little bit more concerned about bumping into objects than finding that woman. who I could no longer see. These people were blinded and they still groped for the door. This is a group of people that is totally given over to an overcoming and overwhelming passion. Which of these two things fits the description? Is it true that God's judgment was not for homosexuality per se, but because the people of the town were discourteous to the visitors, violating local customs by attempting to rape them? Well, one of the sources says this is a mere interrogation. We wanted to find out if these were spies. The word to know, yada, is a word that can mean a couple of different things. Well, I have a problem with the interpretation because look at Lot's response when they seek to know the visitors. Lot says, "Here, take my daughters." Are we to imagine that Lot is saying, "Men, don't do this wicked deed. Instead, interview my daughters. Interrogate my daughters"? It just doesn't seem to fit the context. Matter of fact, he uses the phrase, "They have not yet known a man." In other words, they're virgins. Well, what does that have to do with the interview? No, they weren't there to interview. This was a sexual assault that was being planned and attempted to be perpetrated. Was God's judgment, and this is the other point of view, the one that Dr. Hart says is the accepted point of view generally in a scholarship today, was God's judgment for attempted gang rape incidentally and subsequently, for the most part, inhospitality? That's the big crime, inhospitality. And I have two problems with that. One is biblical and the other one is, I guess, rational. I don't know how else to tag this. Let me give you the first and the second. Was God's judgment against the gang rape and inhospitality to Lot's visitors? The answer is no. It could not have been. How do I know that? Because God planned to judge them before the attempted gang rape and before the inhospitality. The judgment was because the outcry from Sodom had already gone up to God. It was because of an ongoing lawless, sensuous activity that God was going to judge them. Not for this incident of gang rape, but for the wickedness that was characterized by some other activities that made God angry and demanded his judgment.